You need to leave this property immediately before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." The words exploded from Patricia Brennan's mouth like bullets, her perfectly manicured finger stabbing toward the exit gate as if she could physically expel me through sheer force of will. She stood, blocking the entrance to what used to be my family's private fishing camp. Dressed in an expensive pantsuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Her highlighted hair not moving an inch, despite the December wind whipping across the Oregon coast. Behind her, a uniformed security guard with Coastal Properties Enforcement embroidered on his tactical vest rested his hand meaningfully on the radio, clipped to his belt, ready to summon backup for this dangerous intruder who'd dared to approach the property his own grandfather had built in 1958. Patricia. I'm Tyler Brennan. My family has owned Sunset Cove for 66 years. I have the deed in my truck right now. My voice stayed level despite the rage building in my chest. Years of working offshore oil rigs teaching me to stay calm when pressure mounted. I gestured toward the weathered cabins visible through the trees. The same structures where I'd learned to fish and maintain marine equipment alongside my grandfather every summer until he passed. I don't care if you claim to be the King of England. Patricia shrieked, her voice hitting a pitch that made seagulls scatter from nearby pilings. This is private coastal estates property under my management, and you are in violation of about 17 different security protocols. She waved a leather-bound folder at me like it was a court order signed by the Supreme Court itself. You have exactly 3 minutes to remove yourself before I authorize physical removal and file criminal trespassing charges that will destroy whatever pathetic contractor career you think you have. That's when I pulled out the faded property tax receipt from 1965 that my grandfather had kept in a waterproof case for exactly this kind of emergency. And Patricia Brennan made the catastrophic mistake that would unravel her entire fraudulent empire. Oh, so you think some fake old receipt gives you authority over my oceanfront development? She snatched the document from my hand, barely glancing at it, before crumpling it into a ball and throwing it into the mud like worthless garbage. Anyone can forge old papers. Tyler. What you can't forge is the official HOA documentation that gives me legal authority over every single structure on this coastline. But what Patricia didn't know, what she was about to discover in the most devastating way possible, was that I'd spent the last 3 months working with a maritime property attorney who specialized in coastal land rights. And that crumpled tax receipt she just destroyed on camera in front of 5 witnesses wasn't a copy. It was the original document proving continuous family ownership, complete with the county clerk's official embossed seal that couldn't be replicated and was now covered in Oregon coastal mud because she'd been too arrogant to actually read what she was destroying. The nightmare had started exactly 8 weeks earlier, on the second Tuesday of October 2024, when I returned from my rotation on the deepwater oil platform off the Gulf Coast to find an official-looking letter waiting at my Portland apartment. The envelope bore the seal of Sunset Cove Coastal Estates Homeowners Association with a return address at the family property I'd inherited 3 years ago when my grandfather passed away. I'd been an offshore petroleum engineer for 12 years. Working the grueling 28-day rotations that kept me on drilling platforms for a month at a time before coming home to Oregon for 2 weeks of leave. The schedule was brutal, but paid exceptionally well, allowing me to maintain both my Portland apartment and the coastal property without financial strain. My grandfather's fishing camp had been sitting mostly unused during my offshore rotations, visited only during my brief shore leaves when I'd spend a few days maintaining the structures and enjoying the solitude. The letter's contents made my blood pressure spike immediately. Notice of non-compliance and mandatory remediation screamed across the top in aggressive red lettering, followed by dense paragraphs of bureaucratic language claiming I owed $8,500 in back HOA fees, architectural review violations, and emergency assessment charges dating back to January 2022. The document listed violations I'd supposedly committed: unauthorized structural modifications without HOA approval, failure to maintain approved exterior color schemes, non-compliant dock modifications affecting community waterfront aesthetics, unpaid monthly HOA dues totaling $4,000, special assessment fees for coastal preservation projects totaling $3,000, and administrative penalties for non-response to previous notices totaling $1,500. Every single claim was absurd. I hadn't made any structural modifications. The cabins looked exactly as my grandfather had left them. The exterior colors were the same weathered cedar they'd been for decades. The dock was original 1960s construction that I maintained personally, and I'd never received any previous notices about HOA fees because there had never been an HOA when my grandfather owned the property. The signature at the bottom read, Patricia Brennan, President, Sunset Cove Coastal Estates HOA, with contact information directing all inquiries to a property management office in the nearby town of Seaside. The professional letterhead and official language gave the document an air of legitimacy that would have fooled most people who didn't know the property's history. I called the number listed, expecting maybe a conversation about some administrative mistake or confusion about property boundaries. What I got instead was a voicemail greeting delivered in the kind of imperious tone usually reserved for exclusive country clubs addressing people who couldn't afford the membership fees. You've reached Sunset Cove Coastal Estates Management. President Patricia Brennan handles all compliance matters personally. Leave detailed contact information and your property address. Non-compliance cases are referred directly to our legal counsel and collections agencies without further notice. Delinquent accounts may face property liens and foreclosure proceedings. The threats were immediate and aggressive, designed to intimidate property owners into paying without questioning the legitimacy of the charges. I left a professional message explaining that I'd received their notice but had never been informed of any HOA existence, had inherited the property with no HOA obligations, and wanted to discuss the situation before any fees were paid. 3 days passed without any response. No return call. No email. Nothing. But on the 4th day, a certified letter arrived at my Portland address with even more aggressive language and escalated penalties. Final notice before legal action. Your continued non-compliance with Sunset Cove Coastal Estates HOA regulations has resulted in additional penalties. Total amount now due $9,750. Payment must be received within 14 days, or the HOA will initiate foreclosure proceedings to recover delinquent fees through forced sale of your property. This is your last opportunity for voluntary compliance. The amount had mysteriously increased by $1,250 in less than a week, apparently growing through some magical formula that Patricia had invented to maximize financial pressure. But it was the foreclosure threat that crossed the line from bureaucratic intimidation into what looked increasingly like extortion. I spent that evening digging through my grandfather's old files, looking for any documentation about HOA agreements or property restrictions. What I found instead was a complete history of ownership that told a very different story than Patricia's notices suggested. The original property deed from 1958 showed my grandfather, Robert Brennan. Purchasing 63 acres of undeveloped Oregon coastline directly from the State Forestry Service. The land included 800 feet of ocean frontage, 2 natural coves, a small freshwater creek, and heavily forested uplands that had never been subdivided or developed beyond my grandfather's fishing cabins. Every property tax bill from 1958 through the present showed continuous Brennan family ownership. Every utility hookup, electricity from the rural power co-op, well water from the private system my grandfather had installed. Septic systems he'd maintained personally showed the same family name without any transfers or management agreements. Most tellingly, I found my grandfather's handwritten notes from 2021. Apparently, in response to some earlier contact from Patricia Brennan, woman from property management company stopped by offering to help manage the coastal land. Told her the Brennan property isn't for sale and doesn't need management. She seemed pushy about getting signatures on some documents. Declined. She didn't seem happy about it. The notes were dated March 15th, 2021. Less than 3 months before my grandfather died of heart failure at age 87. The timing was suspicious. Patricia had apparently approached him about management agreements when he was elderly and potentially vulnerable. And now she was claiming authority over property that had never been transferred to any HOA. I called Margaret Foster, the maritime property attorney my grandfather had used for decades to handle coastal land issues. She'd retired from active practice but still consulted on complex property cases. And my grandfather had trusted her expertise completely. Tyler. Your grandfather specifically mentioned this woman to me before he passed. Margaret said when I explained Patricia's notices, he was concerned she might try something after he died, which is why he made sure all his property documents were in perfect order. Let me review what you've got. But this sounds like someone's trying to manufacture authority they don't actually possess. I scanned and emailed her copies of Patricia's notices, my grandfather's property records, and the tax bills showing continuous family ownership. Her response came back within 2 hours. And it was professionally devastating to Patricia's claims. Tyler, this is fraud. Pure and simple. Your grandfather never signed any HOA agreements, never transferred management authority, and never agreed to any fee structures. The property was inherited by you with clear title and no encumbrances. This Patricia Brennan has zero legitimate authority over your land, and her threats about foreclosure are legally worthless. But we need to be strategic about how you respond, because people running scams like this don't give up easily when challenged. Margaret's advice was clear. Document everything meticulously. Don't pay any fees under duress, and prepare for Patricia to escalate when her authority was questioned. She's counting on you being intimidated by official-looking paperwork and legal threats. When you demonstrate that you understand property law and have legitimate documentation, she'll either back down or do something stupid that exposes her fraud more completely. I composed a formal response, citing Oregon property law and my grandfather's continuous ownership. Attached copies of the tax records and deed, and explained that I had no obligation to pay fees to an organization that had no legitimate authority over property I owned outright. The email was professional, factual, and gave Patricia every opportunity to recognize her mistake and withdraw her claims. Her response arrived 18 hours later, and it was shockingly aggressive for what should have been straightforward legal clarification. Mr. Brennan, your refusal to acknowledge legitimate HOA authority is noted and will be documented for legal proceedings. The coastal property management agreements were properly executed and legally binding regardless of your personal opinions about their validity. Your continued non-compliance will result in immediate legal action, including property liens, foreclosure proceedings, and criminal charges for interference with community governance. This is not negotiable. Payment is due within 7 days, or face the full consequences of your defiance. Patricia Brennan, President and Legal Authority. Sunset Cove Coastal Estates, HOA. The capitalization and threats were designed to intimidate, but the legal language was completely empty. Patricia was claiming authority she couldn't prove and making threats she couldn't legally execute. But the aggression suggested she'd built something that depended on people not questioning her claims. And my challenge was threatening whatever structure she'd constructed. That's when I decided to visit the property in person to see what Patricia had been doing while I was offshore for the past 3 years. What I discovered when I drove down the coastal highway towards Sunset Cove made everything suddenly, horrifyingly clear. The entrance to what had been my family's private fishing camp was now blocked by professional-grade security infrastructure that looked like it belonged at a corporate facility rather than a coastal property. The massive steel gate with its keypad lock and multiple surveillance cameras had replaced the simple chain link gate my grandfather had installed to keep cattle from wandering onto the property. But it was what I could see beyond the security checkpoint that revealed the scope of Patricia's operation. 8 new structures had been built throughout the property, expensive-looking vacation cabins with modern architecture that had nothing to do with my grandfather's rustic fishing camps. Professional landscaping had replaced natural coastal vegetation. A massive community building sat where the old equipment shed used to be, and heavy construction equipment visible in the distance suggested even more development was underway. Patricia Brennan hadn't just claimed management authority over my property, she'd turned it into a vacation rental development and was actively building additional structures without my knowledge or permission. The HOA she'd manufactured wasn't managing existing property, it was a front for unauthorized commercial development on land she didn't own. That's when the security guard emerged from his booth. And the confrontation that would ultimately destroy Patricia's fraudulent empire began to unfold. The question that drove everything that followed wasn't about HOA fees or management agreements anymore. It was simpler and more direct. How many structures had Patricia built on my land? How much money had she made renting them to tourists? And what would happen when she discovered that the offshore petroleum engineer she was threatening actually understood property law better than she did? The security guard who approached my truck that first day was Marcus Webb, a former military police officer whose tactical gear and professional demeanor suggested he took his job seriously. According to his name tag, he'd been working as chief of security for Sunset Cove Coastal Estates for the past 18 months. Sir, this is private property with restricted access, Marcus said, his tone carrying the measured authority of someone trained in de-escalation techniques. Do you have authorization codes for entry? I own this property, I replied, keeping my hands visible on the steering wheel out of respect for his military background. Tyler Brennan. My grandfather built these cabins in 1958. I inherited the land 3 years ago. Marcus's expression shifted slightly, suggesting this wasn't the first time someone had claimed ownership in conflict with Patricia's authority. Sir, I'm going to need you to wait here while I contact management. Don't exit your vehicle, please. He spoke into his radio with military precision bass. This is Webb. We have a code 7 at main gate. Individual claiming family ownership. Request supervisor response. Within minutes, Patricia Brennan arrived in a white luxury SUV that probably cost more than I made in 6 months offshore. She emerged wearing designer casual wear that looked ridiculous for coastal property management. But her confidence suggested she was used to having the final word in these situations. What followed was a systematic humiliation designed to establish dominance and discourage any further challenges to her authority. Patricia demanded that Marcus conduct a full vehicle search for community safety, documenting every item in my truck with photographs and written descriptions as if I were under criminal investigation. My offshore work gear, specialized tools, safety equipment, technical manuals was examined and photographed, with Patricia providing running commentary about suspicious equipment and unauthorized contractor materials. The whole performance was recorded by 3 residents who emerged from nearby cabins with smartphones, apparently summoned specifically to document the confrontation. This is how we protect our community from unauthorized individuals, Patricia announced to the cameras, her voice carrying across the property. Security protocols exist for everyone's safety, and we don't make exceptions just because someone shows up claiming family connections. The theatrical aspect was obvious. This wasn't about security. It was about creating a public record showing Patricia's authority while humiliating anyone who challenged her control. The residents filming seemed practiced in their roles, suggesting they'd participated in similar performances before. After 30 minutes of security screening, Patricia delivered her verdict with the confidence of someone who believed she held absolute power. Mr. Brennan, your claims about property ownership are being investigated. But until you can provide legitimate documentation proving your authority, you are not authorized to access this property. Our legal counsel will review your alleged ownership and contact you with our determination. I have legitimate documentation right here, I said, pulling out copies of the property deed and tax records that Margaret Foster had prepared. Continuous family ownership since 1958. Never transferred. Never sold. Never placed under HOA management. Patricia barely glanced at the documents before dismissing them with a wave of her hand. Anyone can forge old paperwork. Tyler, what you can't forge is the legal HOA structure that's been properly established and recognized by county authorities. Our attorneys will verify your claims, and if they're legitimate, we'll adjust our records accordingly. Until then, you need to leave before I have you removed for trespassing. Marcus looked uncomfortable with the situation, his military training clearly conflicting with orders to eject someone claiming legitimate ownership, but his employment apparently depended on following Patricia's directions, regardless of their legal merit. As I drove away from my own property, forced to leave by security guards protecting someone else's unauthorized development, I noticed construction activity visible through the trees, heavy equipment, building materials, and what looked like foundation work for additional structures, all happening on land my family had paid taxes on continuously for 66 years. The next day, I returned to Margaret Foster's office with photographs and video from my confrontation with Patricia. Margaret's expression darkened as she reviewed the evidence. Her decades of property law experience recognizing patterns I was only beginning to understand. Tyler, this is worse than I thought, she said, spreading aerial photographs of the Sunset Cove property across her desk. Patricia hasn't just claimed management authority, she's built a commercial vacation rental operation on your land. See these structures? They're all new construction from the past 3 years. She's been renting them to tourists, collecting revenue, and treating your inherited property like her personal development project. Margaret pulled up county permit records showing that Patricia had filed for building permits claiming ownership of the coastal property. She's forged ownership documents to get construction permits. established a fake HOA to legitimize her control, and built a business extracting revenue from land she doesn't own. This isn't civil property dispute anymore. This is criminal fraud, forgery, and theft. The full scope of Patricia's operation became clear as Margaret compiled evidence from multiple sources. County building permits showing 8 new structures built since 2021, all claiming Patricia Brennan as property owner. Vacation rental listings, advertising luxury coastal estates cabins at premium rates. With Patricia collecting all revenue, HOA fee collection from rental guests, and a few legitimate property owners she'd convinced to join her manufactured association and ongoing construction, suggesting she planned to expand the development even further. How is this possible, I asked, struggling to understand how someone could build an entire business on property they didn't own. Don't county officials verify ownership before issuing building permits? They're supposed to, Margaret replied grimly. But Patricia has been very strategic. She filed HOA documents that made it look like she was managing a legitimate property owners association. She used forged signatures on HOA agreements to create the appearance of property owner consent. And she apparently convinced a few actual nearby property owners to join her HOA, giving her operation a veneer of legitimacy. Margaret pointed to a document showing Patricia's HOA registration with the county. She filed this HOA paperwork in April 2021, 2 months after approaching your grandfather about management agreements and 1 month before he died. I'm guessing he refused to sign anything. So she waited until after his death to forge the documents she needed. The criminal intent was undeniable. Patricia had deliberately targeted my grandfather's property knowing he was elderly, waited for his death to eliminate the one person who could immediately challenge her authority, then manufactured legal documents to support development on land she'd never legitimately acquired. What's our strategy? I asked. Watching Margaret compile evidence with the methodical precision of an attorney who'd won hundreds of property cases, we document everything meticulously. File criminal fraud complaints with the county district attorney, and prepare for Patricia to do something desperate when she realizes her scheme is collapsing. Margaret said, "People who build fraudulent empires like this don't surrender gracefully. When confronted with evidence that destroys their claimed authority, they either flee or escalate. And given how much money Patricia has invested in this development, I'm guessing she'll escalate." Within 48 hours, Margaret had filed comprehensive criminal complaints with both the county district attorney and the Oregon State Attorney General's office. The documentation was devastating. Forged property documents, fraudulent building permits, vacation rental revenue extracted from stolen property, and a manufactured HOA created specifically to legitimize unauthorized commercial development. Patricia's response to the criminal complaints was exactly what Margaret had predicted: escalation. 3 days after the district attorney's office contacted her about the fraud investigation, Patricia called an emergency community meeting at Sunset Cove to address what she described as malicious attacks on legitimate community governance by a disgruntled individual making fraudulent ownership claims. The meeting was held at the community building she'd constructed on my property, and I attended as an uninvited observer to see how Patricia planned to defend her operation. What I witnessed was a masterclass in manipulation and gaslighting, designed to turn residents against me before anyone could examine the evidence too closely. Tyler Brennan is attempting to destroy our community with false claims about property ownership, Patricia announced to the 47 people gathered in the building. He's filed baseless criminal complaints trying to steal land that belongs to our legitimate HOA. He wants to evict all of you from your homes and demolish the community we've built together. The lies were breathtaking in their audacity. I wasn't trying to evict anyone. I was simply reclaiming property that had never been legally transferred to Patricia's control. But her framing made me sound like a villain, attacking innocent families rather than a property owner defending his inheritance. Several residents who'd bought into Patricia's development stood to express their support, apparently believing they'd purchased legitimate property interests rather than renting space on land Patricia had no right to develop. We paid good money for our cabins. One woman said emotionally, "Patricia helped us invest in coastal property. Now this man wants to take it all away." What none of them understood was that their investment was worthless because Patricia had sold them property rights she didn't possess. They'd been defrauded just as thoroughly as I had. But Patricia had convinced them that I was the threat rather than her fraud being the problem. Tom Richardson, one of the few legitimate nearby property owners who joined Patricia's HOA, asked the question that cut through her manipulation. "Patricia, can you show us the actual ownership documents proving the HOA controls the coastal property Tyler is claiming? Because if his tax records and deed are legitimate, don't we have a serious problem?" Patricia's response revealed exactly how much she'd invested in maintaining the illusion of authority. "Our legal counsel has verified all ownership documentation," she announced. Without producing any actual evidence, Tyler's so-called proof consists of easily forged tax receipts that anyone could manufacture. What you can't forge is the county-recognized HOA structure that we've built through proper legal channels. But Tom wasn't satisfied with bureaucratic deflection. "Show us the deed." He insisted, if the HOA owns this property, there should be a recorded deed showing transfer from the Brennan family. That's basic property law. The silence that followed was telling. Patricia shuffled through her leather folder, apparently searching for documents that didn't exist. "Our attorneys maintain those records for security purposes," she said finally. "I don't carry original property deeds to community meetings where they could be damaged or stolen." It was exactly the kind of non-answer that people give when they don't actually have the evidence they're claiming exists. Tom's expression suggested he was beginning to recognize that Patricia's authority might be less solid than she'd led everyone to believe. That's when I stood up and addressed the room directly, making sure everyone understood what Patricia had been hiding. "I'm Tyler Brennan. This property has been in my family since 1958. My grandfather paid taxes on it for 60 years. I've paid taxes on it for the past 3 years. Every utility bill, every county assessment, every piece of official documentation shows continuous Brennan family ownership with zero transfers to any HOA. I pulled out my phone and displayed the county tax records showing current tax payments in my name. If Patricia's HOA owns this land, why am I still paying property taxes on 63 acres, including every structure you're sitting in right now?" The question hung in the air like a bomb that nobody knew how to defuse. Patricia's face flushed red with rage. But several residents were clearly beginning to process the implications of what I'd just revealed. "This meeting is over," Patricia announced abruptly. "Legal matters will be handled through proper channels, not public forums where disgruntled individuals can spread lies and confusion." She stormed out of the community building she'd constructed on my property, leaving behind residents who were finally starting to ask the questions she'd been desperate to avoid. If Tyler owns the land and pays the taxes, what exactly does our HOA fee money pay for? If Patricia doesn't have legitimate ownership, what happens to the money we invested in our cabins? And most importantly, Why has Patricia been so aggressive about preventing anyone from examining the actual property documents? Driving home that evening, I realized Patricia's scheme was built on a foundation that couldn't withstand serious scrutiny. She'd manufactured authority through aggressive confidence and bureaucratic theater, counting on people being too intimidated or uninformed to question her claimed legitimacy. But once residents started asking for actual evidence rather than accepting her declarations, the entire structure would collapse. The only question was whether Patricia would surrender when confronted with irrefutable proof, or whether she'd do something desperate to protect the fraudulent empire she'd built on stolen land. Based on her escalating aggression and the amount of money she'd invested in the development, I was betting on desperate. The county district attorney's investigation moved faster than I'd anticipated, driven by the clear evidence Margaret Foster had compiled and the obvious scope of Patricia's fraud. Within 2 weeks of filing the criminal complaint, I received notification that the DA's office had opened a formal investigation into multiple felony charges, forgery of property documents, fraud in obtaining building permits, theft by deception for collecting revenue from property she didn't own, and racketeering for operating an ongoing criminal enterprise. But Patricia wasn't waiting passively for the investigation to conclude. Her next move revealed just how desperate she'd become to protect her operation from legal scrutiny, and how little she understood about property law when confronted by someone who actually knew what they were doing. She filed for a restraining order against me, claiming I was harassing community residents, threatening violence, and interfering with legitimate property management operations. The petition was filled with dramatic allegations about my aggressive behavior, references to offshore work suggesting access to dangerous equipment, and pattern of intimidation designed to frighten elderly residents. The lies were so absurd they were almost comical. But the legal strategy was clear. If she could portray me as a dangerous threat, she might convince a judge to issue an order keeping me away from the property while her criminal defense team tried to delay the fraud investigation. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for early November in Clatsop County Court. Patricia arrived with an expensive attorney whose polished presentation suggested she was paying premium rates to defend her fraudulent operation. They'd prepared testimony from several residents claiming I'd disrupted community peace and created fear through aggressive property claims. Margaret Foster had prepared a very different presentation. She brought documented evidence of continuous Brennan family ownership, photographs showing Patricia's unauthorized development, financial records proving she'd collected hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue from vacation rentals on property she didn't own, and copies of the forged documents Patricia had filed with the county to obtain building permits. Judge Anderson reviewed the evidence with the careful attention of someone who understood that property fraud cases had serious implications. When Patricia's attorney tried to argue that the restraining order was necessary to protect community safety, the judge interrupted with a question that demolished their entire strategy. "Counselor, if Ms. Brennan is claiming legitimate HOA authority over this property, can you produce the deed showing property transfer from the Brennan family to the HOA?" Judge Anderson's tone suggested he already knew the answer. Patricia's attorney shuffled through documents with growing desperation. "Your Honor, the property management agreements establish legitimate authority without requiring full ownership transfer. The HOA manages the land on behalf of consenting property owners. Except Mr. Brennan never consented to any management agreement." Judge Anderson replied, reading from Margaret's documentation, "His grandfather explicitly refused to sign management documents in 2021. Mr. Brennan inherited the property with clear title and no encumbrances. And according to county tax records, he's been paying property taxes on this land continuously since his grandfather's death. The judge turned to Patricia directly. Ms. Brennan, did you or did you not file building permits claiming ownership of property that's been taxed in the Brennan family name for 66 years? Patricia's response was exactly the kind of bureaucratic doublespeak that people use when they can't defend their actions with facts. The HOA development represents community improvement consistent with coastal preservation goals and proper property management principles. That's not an answer to my question. Judge Anderson said flatly, "Did you file permits claiming ownership of property you don't own?" The silence stretched for 15 seconds before Patricia's attorney intervened. "Your Honor, these are complex property management questions that should be addressed in the criminal fraud investigation rather than restraining order proceedings. I agree completely." Judge Anderson replied, "Which is why I'm denying the restraining order petition and referring this entire matter to the district attorney with a recommendation for expedited investigation. Miss Brennan, you have no legitimate basis for restricting Mr. Brennan's access to property he owns and has been paying taxes on continuously." The ruling was devastating to Patricia's operation. Not only had she failed to get a restraining order keeping me away from the property, but the judge had essentially confirmed that her claimed authority was fraudulent and recommended criminal prosecution. As we left the courtroom, Patricia's confident facade cracked completely. "This isn't over," she hissed at me in the hallway, her voice carrying the desperate edge of someone whose empire was collapsing. "I've invested years and hundreds of thousands of dollars into developing that coastal property. You can't just steal that investment with some old tax receipts." "I'm not stealing anything," I replied calmly. "I'm reclaiming property my family has owned since 1958. Every structure you built, every dollar you collected, every permit you filed was based on forged documents and fraudulent claims. That's not investment, that's theft." The county's response to Judge Anderson's recommendation was swift and comprehensive. Within 72 hours, building inspectors arrived at Sunset Cove to examine the structures Patricia had constructed without legitimate authority. What they discovered made the criminal charges even more serious than Margaret had anticipated. 6 of the 8 vacation cabins Patricia had built failed to meet current building codes because she'd cut corners to maximize profit. The community building had been constructed without proper permits because she couldn't get legitimate approval without proving property ownership. The septic systems serving the new development were grossly inadequate for the number of structures, creating environmental contamination that violated Oregon coastal protection laws. And the heavy construction visible in the distance when I'd first visited was preparation for 12 additional cabins that would have catastrophically overloaded the property's infrastructure. She wasn't just stealing your land. The county building inspector explained to me during their investigation, she was creating an environmental disaster that would have contaminated the coastal watershed. The septic system she installed can't handle the load from her existing rentals, let alone the expansion she was planning. The environmental violations added state-level charges to Patricia's growing list of legal problems. Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality opened its own investigation into coastal zone violations, septic system failures, and unauthorized development in protected watersheds. But Patricia's most desperate move was still to come, facing criminal charges, civil lawsuits from defrauded investors, and environmental fines that could reach millions of dollars. She made one final attempt to legitimize her claim to the coastal property, an attempt so brazenly fraudulent that it sealed her fate completely. She forged a quitclaim deed supposedly signed by my grandfather in March 2021. transferring the Sunset Cove property to her HOA 1 month before his death. The document was professionally printed on legal-sized paper with official formatting, complete with what appeared to be my grandfather's signature and a county notary seal. The forgery was sophisticated enough that it might have fooled casual inspection, but it contained one fatal flaw that Margaret Foster spotted. Immediately, the notary seal showed a commission expiration date of December 2025, but the notary, whose name appeared on the document, had actually died in June 2020, 8 months before the deed was supposedly notarized. Patricia forged a document using a dead notary's information. Margaret explained with grim satisfaction. That's not just property fraud anymore, that's felony forgery using false governmental instruments. When she files this with the county recorder's office claiming it's legitimate, she'll be committing additional felonies that will add years to her prison sentence. We waited to see if Patricia would actually be foolish enough to file the obviously forged deed. The answer came 3 days later when the county recorder's office flagged a suspicious document filed by Patricia Brennan claiming to transfer ownership of the Sunset Cove property from Robert Brennan to the Coastal Estates HOA. The county recorder, who'd worked with my grandfather for decades and knew the property's history, immediately recognized the forgery and notified the district attorney's office. Patricia had taken the bait and created documented evidence of felony forgery in a desperate attempt to legitimize her fraudulent claim. The criminal complaint filed by the district attorney in late November 2024 was comprehensive and damning. 7 counts of forgery, 12 counts of fraud, 6 counts of theft by deception, multiple environmental violations, racketeering for operating an ongoing criminal enterprise, and my personal favorite, attempted theft of real property through fraudulent documents. Patricia's arrest happened on a Tuesday morning at the Sunset Cove property while she was meeting with potential investors about her planned expansion. Marcus Webb, the security guard who'd been enforcing her rules, stood aside as sheriff's deputies executed the arrest warrant, his expression suggesting he'd figured out he'd been working security for a criminal operation rather than a legitimate property management company. The scene was almost poetic. Patricia being arrested for property crimes on land she'd never owned, surrounded by structures she'd built without legitimate authority, while facing charges that could send her to prison for 20 years. This is a witch hunt. Patricia screamed as deputies escorted her to the patrol car. Tyler Brennan fabricated evidence because he wants to steal valuable coastal property. My attorneys will prove that the Brennan ownership claims are fraudulent, but her protests couldn't overcome the documentary evidence. Tax records showing continuous Brennan family ownership, utility bills in the Brennan name going back 66 years, my grandfather's notes about refusing Patricia's management schemes, and most devastating of all, the forged quitclaim deed using a dead notary's information. The civil consequences for the people who'd invested in Patricia's development were heartbreaking. Families who thought they'd purchased legitimate coastal property interests discovered they'd bought nothing but worthless claims based on forged documents. The cabins they'd invested in were built on land Patricia never owned and would likely be demolished for building code violations and environmental remediation. Tom Richardson, the nearby property owner who'd questioned Patricia's authority during the community meeting, approached me with genuine remorse. I should have demanded to see actual ownership documents before joining her HOA, he said. But she was so confident, so professional, so convincing. I just assumed someone operating at that scale must have legitimate authority. That's what fraudsters count on. I replied, feeling sympathy for the legitimate victims of Patricia's scheme. They project confidence and authority to prevent people from asking the questions that would expose their lies. The property restoration took 4 months of intensive work. County building inspectors condemned 6 of the 8 vacation cabins for code violations, requiring complete demolition. The 2 structures that met minimal standards were removed as unauthorized construction on private property. The community building was dismantled and salvaged for materials. An environmental contractor spent weeks remediating the septic contamination Patricia's development had created. By March 2025, Sunset Cove looked much as it had when my grandfather first built his fishing camp's natural coastal forest. Weathered cedar cabins, and peaceful solitude that had nothing to do with Patricia's luxury vacation rental fantasy. Patricia Brennan pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges in exchange for a reduced sentence that still guaranteed 18 months in federal prison, followed by 5 years of probation. The plea agreement required full restitution to defrauded investors, though the amount she owed far exceeded her capacity to repay. Her attorney estimated she'd collected over $400,000 in vacation rental revenue and investor contributions during her 3-year fraud operation. The investors who'd bought into her scheme faced financial devastation, having paid substantial sums for property interests that never existed. Several filed civil lawsuits seeking recovery, but Patricia's assets had been seized to cover environmental remediation costs and criminal restitution, leaving little available for civil judgments. The cautionary tale of Patricia Brennan's fake HOA spread through Oregon's coastal communities, serving as a warning about the dangers of manufactured authority and the importance of verifying property ownership before accepting anyone's claims about development rights or management authority. Marcus Webb, the former security guard, reached out to apologize for his role in Patricia's scheme. "I was a legitimate employee, doing what I was told," he explained. "But I should have questioned why someone operating a legal HOA would be so aggressive about preventing property owners from accessing their own land. The warning signs were there, and I ignored them because the paychecks cleared." A year after Patricia's arrest, I stood on the dock my grandfather had built in 1962, watching the sunset paint the Oregon coast in shades of orange and gold that had drawn my family to this land 6 decades earlier. The vacation rental cabins were gone. The manufactured HOA had been dissolved, and the property had returned to its original purpose, a quiet refuge where the Brennan family could fish, maintain marine equipment, and enjoy coastal solitude. The legal resolution was complete. Patricia's criminal conviction was final. The environmental remediation had restored natural coastal ecosystems, and the property tax bill I'd just paid showed the same continuous family ownership that had existed since my grandfather's original purchase in 1958. Margaret Foster called with a final update on the civil cases. Most of the defrauded investors have settled their claims against Patricia's estate, she said. They're recovering maybe 20 cents on the dollar, which is better than nothing, but still financially devastating for people who thought they were making legitimate investments. "What happened to Tom Richardson?" I asked, remembering the nearby property owner who'd questioned Patricia's authority when others were still supporting her fraud. "He's fine," Margaret replied. "He was one of the few who only paid minimal HOA dues rather than investing in property purchases. He lost maybe $2,000 total. The people who really got hurt were the ones who paid $50,000 or more, thinking they were buying coastal property interests. The lesson was clear, and expensive confidence isn't evidence. Professional presentation doesn't equal legitimacy. And people who resist showing actual ownership documents are usually hiding the fact that they don't possess the authority they're claiming." Patricia Brennan had built an impressive facade of legitimacy through aggressive bureaucracy, professional security, manufactured documentation, and sheer confidence. But when challenged by someone who actually understood property law and had maintained meticulous records, her entire operation collapsed as quickly as it had been constructed. The offshore oil platform where I worked my rotations had taught me that structural integrity depends on solid foundations built to precise specifications. Patricia had tried to build a commercial empire on forged documents and manufactured authority, a foundation that couldn't support serious scrutiny and collapsed completely when tested. The sunset faded over Sunset Cove as evening settled across the Oregon coast, painting the horizon in deepening shades of purple and gold. The property was quiet again, restored to the peaceful refuge my grandfather had envisioned when he first purchased this land 66 years ago. Patricia Brennan had learned the hard way that property ownership is established through legal documentation and continuous tax payments, not through confident declarations and aggressive security theater. Her 18-month prison sentence gave her plenty of time to reflect on the difference between legitimate authority and elaborate fraud. And every time I paid the property tax bill showing continuous Brennan family ownership, I remembered the crumpled receipt Patricia had thrown in the mud that first day. The original 1965 tax document with its irreplaceable county clerk's seal, evidence she destroyed on camera in her arrogance, never realizing it was already backed up by 66 years of continuous documentation that her forgeries could never overcome. Sometimes justice is watching someone destroy themselves through their own arrogance, documented by their own actions, prosecuted using evidence they created through their desperation to maintain control they never legitimately possessed. Patricia built her empire on lies, and I demolished it with a single tax bill showing 66 years of truth. Real authority comes from legal documentation, not loud voices. Always check the actual ownership records before accepting anyone's claims about property management rights, because the difference between a legitimate HOA and an elaborate fraud is documentation that can withstand scrutiny, and Patricia Brennan's manufactured empire couldn't survive even basic investigation. The fishing camp my grandfather built endures. The fraudulent vacation resort Patricia constructed has been erased, and the Oregon coastline remains protected by property laws that fraudsters can't override, no matter how confident their presentation or aggressive their security theater. Justice served. Property restored. Fraud exposed. Sometimes the oldest documents carry the most authority, especially when they're backed by 66 years of continuous tax payments that forgers can't fake.